Talk Shoes.
Recorded live.
Hello, and welcome to the Virtualization Security Roundtable, episode number 71. We were supposed to have this 2 weeks ago, but due to unforeseen circumstances, I could not get a signal in the town I was in London, so we are now here. 2 weeks later, joining us today is Eben Rodriguez, who consults with enterprises to assist them secure and operate their virtual environments. Actually, Eben now works for eBay. What do you do at eBay?
I'm a cloud infrastructure security architect.
Ooh, we need to get that in there.
Yeah.
Normally joining us is also Michael Berman, the CTO of Catbird, and Hema Chandra, the CTO of HITRUST. Tim Pearson is a contributing author for my book, VMware, vSphere, and Virtual Infrastructure Security, and the owner of Data Center Inc., and he actually makes our podcast sound better when they're on iTunes, which you can find them there. And my name is Edward Holutke, a.k.a. TexIWill, on the VMware Communities Forum and Twitter and pretty much everywhere else, and author of the book VMware, vSphere, and Virtual Infrastructure Security, Securing the Virtual Environment, which is available from Amazon. So today is an open topic, which means we are going to talk about just about anything. And a couple of things we were talking about prior to this is actually rather intriguing. There's a new company, and even you mentioned them, HiCloud.
Yeah.
Looking at them. Why don't we talk about them for a little bit?
Well, from what I know, they have a storage solution that works with VMware right now. It's kind of like presents an NFS data store to ESX. That's their current testing. And they use the AES-NI chipset instructions that Intel, they're fairly newer. Some of the older processors don't have that, to accelerate on-the-fly encryption of your data. They don't encrypt all of the files that a VM would use. Like there's some VMDK files you might not want to encrypt, and there's some that you do. But for the important ones that you do want to encrypt, they will encrypt that on the fly. So when you create a new version...
So they encrypt it as it's being written to the NFS volume.
Yeah, so the whole process starts when you create
data at rest encryption.
Exactly.
Okay, so here's the big... there's a couple of problems with data at rest encryption. I was actually talking to A4 Solutions about this because I have something similar. And that is that data at rest encryption is really never... in a virtual environment, data is never at rest. So encrypting it at rest means, yes, I can protect my volume from being stolen, like someone taking the disk out and walking away with it. But the virtualization admin can always still log in and get access to that VMDK. And since it's actually being read off the data store as normal, it's already decrypted. So there's nothing to prevent an admin from actually being able to read or write that.
Yeah, so, I mean, like any type of security solution, you need a defense in-depth policy, and this would be one of the components of that. Mm-hmm. Some of the use cases would be medical data, if you have different customers that you're protecting, like for cloud providers, and you need to tell the customers that their data is kept separate from other customers' data, then you can create different data stores, each one with its own encryption key for those customers. So that if it were in a colo, and like you said, somebody did steal the machine, it would be protected against that particular situation. Obviously, there's other types of protections you need to put in place to prevent the other types of attacks that you talked about, but this is just one type of solution.
Yeah, and I think encryption at rest is a mighty important in the cloud. I'm not going to say it's not, but my main concern about it is the false sense of security that you may get by using it. And that is that, as I said, it's the cloud administrator that can still log into the vSphere, into vCenter, open up that VMDK and still read it because it's already decrypted by then. So when I'm looking at it from a vCenter or a vSphere server, it's always in motion from that perspective. It's never at rest because it's always encrypted. What I think the real key here is to encrypt from within the VM, not at the data store level. I think you need both.
Right.
For different reasons. But data store level is more preventing the disk from being stolen. Can it be decrypted? That's absolutely necessary. Yeah. But if I encrypt within the VM, that means that if I have to be in the VM to actually decrypt it, that means it's also encrypted at rest. It's just encrypted at a higher layer.
Would that be best within the guest operating system, or would you expect the hypervisor to do that?
Right now, the only way to do it is from within inside the guest. So if I'm using Windows, you would use BitLocker. Now, there is a risk to this, but it's a smaller risk, and that is the admin dumping memory and using one of the AES BitLocker crackers to get the key out of that memory that they dump. But it's a longer period of time. It's not something that just you run it and go. It's a little bit more difficult, but by doing it in the VM, I'm encrypted from end to end. By doing it at the data store or at the switch or at the storage device, I'm only encrypted from that point on. So right now, I think it's in the guest is really necessary. If it was done in the VM object, right? When it's running, I think that would be fine too. If VMware was to encrypt memory, I would be a whole lot happier. If any hypervisor was to encrypt memory, I'd be a whole lot happier, I think. Does that make sense, even?
Yeah, for sure.
So yes, encryption at rest is absolutely important for exactly what we mentioned, stolen drives.
I had to help a customer out recently. They were trying to test it out, and there were a lot of different network design issues that needed to be considered because they were switching from using all local storage for this purpose. So for each customer, they had a separate ESX host with its own local data store for this purpose. And the idea is by using high-cloud, they were able to consolidate a lot of that storage into one device and provide the same level of control that they currently had.
I wonder what the forensics would be like on that if they were sharing volumes between high-cloud volumes or any volume between tenants. You would think the forensics would be rather difficult.
So you can create data stores. I forget the name they use. Volumes, I think, is the name they use. You make one for each customer, and each customer would have their own keys for those volumes. Actually, each virtual machine even has its own keys.
So this is a virtual storage appliance.
Yeah.
So it's pulling its storage from some shared location. Let's say, let's just pick an IBM SAN, for example.
Yeah, it could run either. So let's say you had a white box that you wanted to install. You download an ISO file, and then you would burn a CD or something, and then install their software on your white box hardware. And then that hardware that you had, say you built your own server with a bunch of disk drives, that would be your NAS running this high cloud security software.
Yeah, ANS and I would work in that situation. My big question would be, does ANS and I work inside of a VM? And from my understanding, it does not.
Yeah, that's the other deployment method is in a VM.
And you're saying you believe it does work in there?
Like I said, I was helping a small medical records company do that, and they were running it in a VM, and they had to make sure that the hardware they're using had AES-NI capabilities. So there's some tests. I think it would be good, like you said, forensically to look at how that works and is it really working. But supposedly the CPU ID mask of the actual CPU hardware is being exposed to the virtual machine, and that makes this technology available within the secure storage device.
Yeah, no, those masks are always available. I mean, I've never seen one that hasn't been.
But they use it. So.
I'll have to check with my colleagues at Intel because they were telling me it wasn't, but if it is, now that's actually a big boon to even things like TrueCrypt and BitLocker, and actually in VM encryption could make use of AES.
Exactly.
Oh,
now,
cool.
the other thing...
But to make use of it, you need a Westmere processor or a grader, like a Sandy Bridge.
Sure.
Westmere or Sandy Bridge will be the only ones currently that have AES and I built into it.
Now, the other technology that Intel has been touting that is supposedly improving security on virtual or cloud hardware is the TXT, and that one I know is only partially being utilized by VMware, and I don't think it's being used on any of the other hypervisors yet.
Actually, it is.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually,
only at boot time.
Who's saying that?
It's only at boot time that they are using TXT, and they're trying to get real run level TXT working. So while the hypervisor is running, it can check the hardware. It doesn't
currently. That doesn't exist today at all. It's a technological gap.
Yeah, that's what they were saying isn't there yet.
Yeah, TXT works on boot for Zen, free Zen. I believe it also works for Zen Server, as well as any version of ESXi. Version 4 and 5 have T-boot capability, which is the TXT boot capability.
And I'd read something that HighTrust, isn't that the other company that had said that they do something with Intel TXT where a virtual machine can only boot up on the correct ESX host?
Yeah, they do. This is HighTrust has it, as well as Intel has it, and some of the GRC tools like Archer from RSA have it, and that is that they will set a flag saying this is a VM for this type of server, and they will look to make sure that you're inside the right jurisdictional control, which you can actually embed inside of the TXT. So if you want to know, is this in Japan, they would mark it as being in Japan. If this is in, if the machine is in, say, the U.S., they can mark it as being in the U.S. And that sticks until you basically reinstall and flush the TXT TPM buffers of the hardware. And there's a special way you have to do that.
Can you tell me if you know anything about how Archer handles that?
They throw a flag up saying that you've now crossed boundaries.
But I mean, is that something? Is it Archer software something that's installed on the hypervisor or in the VM?
No, Archer is using they're using vCenter, and vCenter can gain access to that data through the Intel plugins.
Through a plugin that's installed on like a Windows VM?
It's from Intel, yeah. You can actually, that information is available to vCenter. It's available to the Intel plugin, and HighTrust actually allows you to enable TXT on ESXi.
That'd be great to get some more details on how that technology works.
It's actually pretty interesting. It has a few drawbacks, and that is, as I said, you encode into the TXT layer of the hardware where it is, like possibly a GPS location, a country, a state, a name, some sort of tag. And when you encode it, it sticks there until you reinstall and wipe that encoding, and that takes a bit of magic to happen. But if you ship that box outside the country, let's say it's encoded for U.S. and you ship it to France, it still says it's encoded for U.S. So you have to re-encode it given where it is. Well, that's one way to get around this particular problem of geolocation. So there's no GPS attached to it so that it keeps up to date given where the GPS location of the hardware is, which would be kind of cool.
So we're going to have to start asking Intel to embed GPSs onto their hardware.
Why not, right?
Yeah.
If you really want to guarantee where it is, you don't want to trust some user to say where it is. You want to trust some hardware that knows where it is.
Yeah, that'd be pretty far out.
Either that or go by IP. And as Rick says, 3G signals could also do it, as could 3G signals tied to an IP address to ensure that the IP address is of the country that you say you're in. You get double checks. So, I mean, those are pretty interesting ideas. But, yeah, ESXi, vSphere 5 definitely has it. And I know Zen has it. I believe Microsoft's new version may have capability using it. I'm not positive. So you did some of the things that we were talking about prior to the call, and that one is there's anything new in the cloud?
Yeah.
Because the Cloud Security Alliance is doing its thing next month. There's a symposium going on this week. Is it this week or next week in Santa Barbara?
Yeah, I got invited to the Santa Clara one. I'm going to go check that out. That's right by my house here in San Jose.
Yep, and then there's actually in 2 weeks is the Cloud Security Alliance one down in Orlando.
That's in Orlando, right?
Yep.
one of my buddies that I work with here is going to be at that show.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be rather intriguing. Every one of these I've gone to when we start talking about cloud and when you start talking about cloud and security is that it has almost nothing to do with security. It has a whole lot to do with policy and legal. I mean, you just went to an IT auditing event, and what was the main question you got?
How do you audit the cloud? It was really challenging for me because I didn't really have a good answer for him. I think that's definitely going to be a question for next year or previous topics. We have all these spreadsheets that we can use to audit the cloud, but is it actually feasible to execute on those spreadsheets and audit? Many cloud providers might not provide you with the information that you're requesting.
And that actually brings up a really interesting question, and it's the one we've had repeated on and on on this podcast throughout the last couple of years, and that is that right now it's all about your contracts with the cloud providers. If you do not have the right to audit in your contract, there is no right to audit. Now, hopefully that will be changing soon once cloudaudit.org gets accepted by every cloud vendor. Then that information will be provided, hopefully, to their tenants on request, easily on their request. The whole idea was to build out this namespace that could be filled in with the details of various audits so that you can quickly query to see, does this cloud meet my PCI requirements? Does this cloud meet my SAS 70 requirements? Does it meet COBIT requirements and so forth? All these different compliance and audit requirements. That could be done. The problem is that now there's only a few clouds that have actually accepted that.
So is there a list on the CSA website or somewhere?
Cloudaudit.org, and not that I know of.
All right.
Not that I know of. And that's the problem.
I found one of the companies that invited me to this cloud. It's called Cloud Expo in Santa Clara next week. Is a company that we had on the podcast earlier. Do you remember a guy named Carson from Cloud Passage?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, so he's going to be over there, and they have a tool called Ghost Ports. So one of the things I learned, I didn't know this about Cloud Passage, it's actually free for you to use. Anybody can use Cloud Passage for free. If you want support or you want to use the APIs, that's when you have to start paying them. So you can actually have Amazon, VMware, wherever you have your Linux machines in the cloud, you can use this Cloud Passage IDS, firewall, central configuration management tool to manage your cloud VMs for free. And I think that is just...
Only Linux VMs, and only for managing the firewall settings, so the IP table settings on them.
Yep. But I mean, hey, that's central management for free pretty much in the cloud. I think it's great.
It's an interesting concept, but it's very limited.
But one of the tools that they have, which I want to test, you can request a free USB key from them. And obviously, if you want more, you got to buy them. But if you just want one for testing, if you're setting up, a lot of cloud shops are just one-person operations. You have an authentication tool called Ghost Ports. Have you heard of that?
No.
So I'm putting a link on the podcast. It's from Cloud Passage, and supposedly it uses your, it's like a two-factor authentication token. So let's say you have a laptop, you plug in this USB dongle. They're the UB keys, right? So you put your finger on there, and it generates like a secure ID token, a key, like a number, a random number. And then you can use that to log in to your cloud machine. Say you're trying to SSH in or use a web application. But what Ghost Ports does is it does it on a random port. So only you know what port to connect to on that.
It's probably using port knocking or something like that.
It's a combination of port knocking and multi-factor authentication.
I think that's a great idea. So then you could actually go off and use Then you can go off and use their Halo to manage the IP tables firewalls.
Yeah. So I just heard about this. I got to check it out. I don't know if anybody else on the call has tried that yet.
Well, I haven't. I know about what they had. I didn't know they had the USB dongle yet. I think
Yeah,
it's a great idea.
Put the link in the chat session.
So, yeah. Now, I mean, but it still boils down to if you're using the cloud, the best thing you can do is, if you want to audit it, is you need to build that into your contract. And if you're a small guy, that may or may not be possible, so you may want to look at a different cloud. Or make sure request that the cloud be part of cloudaudit.org and you have access to the data. I mean, cloudaudit.org is also another useful tool because the vast majority of cloud audit and compliance requirements are being handled by single people or a couple of people inside the cloud team, cloud provider, and they get overwhelmed very quickly, so you may not get your request for a few days or a few weeks until they got everything else in the way before that up. Well, by then it could be too late. So asking them to use cloudaudit.org, the cloud audit functionality is a big win.
So Ed, I'm going to take advantage of your expertise on this topic and ask you a few questions about that, okay?
Sure.
So let's say my company, theoretically speaking, has a internal cloud project. Not saying they do or don't. And let's say I wanted to audit that from a security perspective. I would go to cloudaudit.org, and I see there's a zip file there.
Well, that's a namespace file. So what it does is it contains the namespace and possibly a tool to fill out that namespace. So what it is a web-based namespace that you can put out on a web server, and then you can fill that in.
I'm not a master auditor, so I want you to give me a 5-second crash course on...
It's just a list of directories that you then would have to fill out,
so
either by hand or automatically.
Does it ask? Are they basic questions that I would look at and it'd be obvious to me what it is do there?
They reference the different standards they support. PCI being one of them, COBIT, a few others, and so forth. So some of these, if you look at PCI, for example, is very prescriptive. So what they can do is you can literally write a tool that says, this is the PCI data I need, and you can run it all the time. And that way, what you can do is fill out that namespace with the data at real time, which is pretty cool.
So there's all these zip files in there.
Yeah, and they're the namespace files and possibly a script to fill it out.
I see. So they have Excel spreadsheets in there.
Some of them can. You can have any chunk of data you want. You can have an image if you want. But the key is that it provides a uniform way, once it is filled out, to be able to be queried by external sources.
Would this also help me with producing a report?
Absolutely, because it's a standard namespace that you can then pull things from there to produce another report.
And so is the idea that later on there might be tools?
Yes, the goal is to have tools to not only create this namespace, and by the way, there exists one tool that I know of to do that already, but it's fairly specific to a given cloud. But the tool does exist, and you can add to it. But again, it requires things that are prescriptive. So, for example, an element that says these VMs need to be on a segregated network. You can do that by looking at IP spaces and IP rules to do that and say, yes, they are. The other alternative is saying, yep, it passes. There's a WAF in front of there. You may not be able to detect that, so you have to fill it in by hand. Right?
WAF is a web application firewall?
Yes. So PCI requires that as well. So there's some things you have to do by hand to fill this out, and there's some things for PCI that you can do automatically. I mean, look at HITRUST and VMware's Configuration Manager and a few others that can actually, in Archer and a bunch of other GRC, that can literally go through and say, hey, let me go off and investigate the environment, read it, and I'll give you a standing as if it was as if you were doing a PCI audit. Here is the results. But it only can give you certain amounts of data before it can't do anything, because some of it's policy and some of it's procedure. It's not all technical.
You've brought up a couple interesting points. I want to dive in a little deeper. Is there what are some examples of the web application firewalls? What are some of the vendors that make those?
That's the wrong question. I have one that's built into WordPress that I use, for example. There's others that are there's some really big names out there, and unfortunately I can't remember any of them.
But correct me if I'm wrong, but don't those sort of
Cisco makes one. I know Juniper makes one. There are a few others out there.
Don't web application firewalls in the original context, they protect web applications from attacks, web attacks?
Well-known attacks like directory traversal attacks.
Right.
It could be also protecting you from embedding other protocols inside of HTTP.
So how does that segregate web-based cloud applications from each other? That's what I didn't understand.
It's not designed for that. It's designed to protect your web server or a series of web servers from well-known attacks.
So let's say I was a cloud provider and I had 100 customers
They
that
could all
use
probably
my
share
cloud.
that WAF. Yes.
So they're not being separated from each other because I have a WAF, but their product, their web applications are protected by my WAF that I provide them.
Well, if you are the cloud and you provide a single WAF, which is not the way I would do it, but I would do one per tenant. Or if you did a single shared one, yeah, it would protect any web application from standard types of attacks.
Right.
I mean, the ones I catch the most for what I'm doing with WordPress and a few other things is directory traversal attacks. People are trying to escape the web Apache or IIS shell and invoke environment settings and other things in shells to break the root volume effectively it's in, the chroot shell that a web is in.
A plugin that I can install in WordPress?
Yeah, it is.
What's the name of that?
WordPress Firewall 2.
Oh, cool.
I wrote an article on this that you guys can read off the www.astroarch.com site that goes off into how you would secure WordPress. It's pretty cool.
Is that pretty recent?
Yes. And I keep it up to date with new tools as I find them.
Oh, very good.
But the web application firewalls are actually extremely useful, and I think that that's why they're in the PCI standard. And there's a bunch of companies that make them. The big boys make them. The smaller companies make them. You can find them anywhere, and they're really just there saying there's a bunch of well-known attacks or non-standard queries that we can detect, and if those non-standard queries get called, then we're going to block it. And you can actually train them and say, oh, I got something new here going, this is a new footprint for you. So some of them are trainable and some of them are not. Is it a cloud security tool per se? Not really. It's been around for years, and it's a layer 3 tool. It's extremely important to have. Hence why they have it on the PCI audit, and that's one of the things you have to actually fill out by hand to say, yes, I have one. It's hard to detect that they're even in play. Unless you made a request to say, I'm going to do this attack, and say, hey, it failed or not. But you can never be guaranteed that that was because of a WAF or because of a better web server.
Right. So the other firewall that I was considering is these new virtual firewalls there's a lot of new versions that are coming out. Like I think Trend Micro has Deep Security.
8.0.
And Juniper has the VGW. McAfee has one. There's the new VMware vShield Zones version. Have you gotten a chance to play with any of those at all, or any of your customers talk about them?
Well, let's talk about deep security for a second. Trend Micro has their 7.5 and their 8.0. From a firewall perspective, the difference is very minor. They're both using a VM-SafeNet firewall. So what that means is it sits between the VNIC and the port group when it comes to the VM. And that's actually where vShield Zones and App sits as well. The difference is vShield Zones is more of a layer 2, and vShield App is more of a layer 2 and 3. vShield Edge, another part of the vShield family, sits as an edge firewall. It does not sit inside of your virtual network. It sits as a VM outside, and you have to actually attach vSwitch to either side, or port groups to either side of it. Endpoint is another vShield capability that sets. That's actually just an endpoint capability for sitting outside of, to do antivirus outside of the VM, which is actually kind of nice. All these provide defense in depth. So there's some changes between 7.5 and 8 for Trend Micro. The VM Safe Net Firewall hasn't really changed a huge amount. There's been a lot of improvements in fail-safe versus fail-over versus fail-nothing. Some of these web tools, this is Christopher Hoff's original, the apocalypse, and that is that you cannot have security tools inside your virtual environment without the capability to fail safe, or you can't have you have to have some form of failover, and if they're on talking internally, they may not be able to do that. So Deep Security invented some more fail safe capabilities. So if the VM SafeNet components and the endpoint components are offline, the agents within inside the VM take over. When they are online, the agents within the VM don't take over, which is kind of a nice way. You get your security regardless of where your VM lives. vShield 5, there's been quite a few changes there, mostly performance improvements, and the UIs are much, much better. And I can't really talk much about those.
One of the challenges we had with previous versions was the lack of ability to group machines. Like, if you got the upgraded feature, you could do it by resource pool, but without that pay feature, you didn't get that.
Excuse me?
So, like, let's say you have 10 machines that are dev and 10 that are prod. They're all on the same IP subnet, but they're intermixed. You know, some are on one IP address, and next to it's another one that's on another IP address, but they're all on the same subnet. And you want to group these 10 as being prod machines and these other 10 as being dev machines, and you say, don't let the dev machines talk to the prod machines.
Yeah, it's exactly what vShield app, zones, and any of the VM SafeNet tools will allow you to do.
Well, not with VMware Zones, without paying for the extra license that gives you app functionality.
Yep.
You can create firewall rules that says don't let IP1 talk to IP2.
That's correct. That's layer 2.
But you can't do it by machine grouping.
No, you have to do it by machine for zones.
Yeah, by IP address.
That's right. And inside of VM SafeNet, you would end up, it depends on the UI, and Trend Micros, you can do it by group.
Right.
Altor, you can do it by group.
But then the
frustrating
part is for external nodes. So let's say you got all these VMs running on your cluster, but let's say there's a developer that can talk to the dev machines, and there's an IT sysadmin desktop that can talk to the prod machines, right? Mm-hmm. If you add another developer and you need that other second developer to talk to the 10 dev machines, you have to modify all 10 firewall rules or create 10 new firewall rules to allow that.
Only for zones.
Yeah, exactly. So
remember, Zones is a very
right?
low-end version of app. It has a lot of things, and so Zones is really not something I would want to use in a major enterprise. In a major enterprise, I would look at one of these other tools, whether it be vShield app or one of the VM SafeNet products like Trend Micro, or Reflex, Checkpoint, etc.
Well, some of those even it seems like they're able to group VMs, like they're very good at saying these VMs and those VMs, but they don't have the ability to group external machines outside of the VM environment too well.
No, because they're not designed for external VMs.
But if you want to firewall your VMs, I guess what I'm saying is they're not a complete replacement for a traditional firewall still.
Actually, they are. It depends on how much you have If you are 100% virtualized, I guarantee you they're a complete replacement. If you're not, then no, you need both still. So in that case, you may want to use Cisco ASGs or the Cisco PIX firewalls in combination. Or you may want to say, okay, I'm going to go with the Juniper series. I have Juniper external, so I'm going to use with VGW inside. Or if I'm using Reflex and I have Tipping Point and other types of HP hardware, I may then say, okay, I'm going to use Reflex inside. That's why they're tied to vendors. vShield is looking purely at the virtual environment. Absolutely. It's not designed for external. But if you have a 100% virtualized environment, their tools are great.
Right.
Right? But no, you're right. It's not a enterprise-wide solution unless you have a 100% virtualized enterprise. And very few companies have that. I mean, you just pointed out one of the major weaknesses in virtualization to start with is as we virtualize more and more, even though we're virtualizing more and more from a security perspective, there's still a lot of sundry things we're not virtualizing that may never be virtualized, at least not in a x86 environment. For example,
so that's interesting point you brought up. There's a lot of demand for bigger and bigger hardware. So one of the big selling points of vSphere 5 was that you can have bigger VMs, more memory, more CPUs, and even larger data stores. And I actually went out to the store as soon as I heard that, and I got myself a 3 terabyte hard drive. And it was kind of funny because it didn't work in my old ESX4 machine, but I had to upgrade ESXi5, and then it worked fine. But come to find out, there's a lot of applications that I use that weren't able to use that 3 terabyte data store that I created under VMware. And so new applications had new patches or whatever had to come out to be able to use that larger than 2 terabyte data store.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's why you can do that. And that brings up an interesting question. Rick, you mentioned it. Rick Vanover's joining us today. He's with Veeam. And
okay.
Rick was mentioning if data security with the likely upcoming shortage of hard drives.
Yeah, that's exactly one of the things is I learned that Dell is actually constraining orders of new systems with 3 terabyte hard drives into next year.
Absolutely, and that's 3 terabytes of enterprise class, 3 terabytes of enterprise class disks. But you still have to worry about, home users that can get 3 terabytes for a couple $100.
Well, so a funny story. I bought my 3 terabyte hard drive off of eBay just because it had the best price. But I went
what
back
did you find on it?
What's that?
What did you find on it?
Oh, no, it was brand new. But the guy that I told one of my buddies about it, and he went to the same guy that I bought it from, and the price had already gone up $10. And I haven't checked lately, but I can imagine they're going up higher now.
Yeah, you're definitely going to see this. I'm actually really concerned about it. I guess I like to worry, but I've been talking with a lot of the storage companies, and yeah, they're seeing supply cuts. In that 1 terabyte and less range, there's a good inventory because that's generally not what's currently produced in the large masses that still, of course, plan to produce. But the supply chain doesn't move quick in terms of repair and realign, but it can break really quick. And I think rotational or solid state, I think we've got a real problem coming up here.
We do and we don't. I imagine disk prices will start climbing, and I see that. But, how many people have more disks than they absolutely need right as of today and could live for the next 3 to 6 months with what they have today? Probably quite
most people.
And most enterprises could too, but by then there may not be a problem. But you're talking data security. Now that becomes a different issue. When I start applying data security like encryption at rest, I have to use more hard drive because encryption takes up more space in general. Now there are ways to encrypt so it doesn't take up more space, but those actually tend to be the weaker encryption algorithms.
Well, where I kind of was going with the idea, Edward, was let's take the typical company, right? You go on the annual budget cycle. Your money's been approved first of the year to go buy XYZ data solution, whatever it be, to secure your data, to distribute your data, to protect it, whatever. And your price may jump. Your option may not be available. That's kind of where I was going with, the impact that this event's going to have. I guess I'm just trying to say we need to make sure every one of us as storage consumers, where our bigger plans be affected.
I think they will be. I think you're going to see things quite a lot different. But remember, there was a survey that just came out. More is spent right now on the company coffee capabilities, producing coffee for the workers than they are in the in the IT security budget. Okay, so how concerned are people with data security? They're more concerned with making sure their admins have coffee than they are concerned about data security. They're only concerned about data security when there is a breach, and then it's usually a knee-jerk reaction instead of a well-thought-out plan. What they need to have, and this is what I would press every CISO to do and every security admin and even every virtualization admin and cloud admin to do, is have a well-thought-out plan of how they're going to respond to a security breach of any type with what they're thinking about getting in for hardware and software to say, okay, I need better defense in depth. What are my options? I need better IPS IDS. What are my options? I need a better WAF. What are my options? These things should be in somebody's hip pocket from day one.
So what I'm seeing is that for IDS and IPS, a lot of those are coming along sort of for free almost with the virtual firewall. So there's a business case for segmentation in the cloud, but then as a side benefit, you get the option to turn those other features on. They do take a resource hit, like you'll need more CPU or more memory, or you won't be able to have a higher consolidation ratio.
No, actually, the firewalls, IPS, ITS, do not come with the virtual firewalls all the time. Altor's talks out to Juniper. Yes, it has one built in. It gets its rules from the Snort folks. But if you really want a good IPS, IDS, it says it talks out to the Juniper version of IDS, IPS, which is Big Iron. For Reflex, with its vTrust, it actually talks out to Tipping Point, which is Big Iron. IBM has one that talks out to XSS, so it's Big Iron. VMware doesn't necessarily have one that does IDS, IPS yet. When you start talking about Trend Micro, they have an IDS, IPS built into theirs that is backed by a cloud. If you're talking about Cloud Passage, theirs is backed by a cloud as well.
Right.
If you're looking at Qualys, theirs is backed by a cloud as well. So the Big Iron is no longer necessarily in your data center, but it's still being used.
That's true.
I mean, IDS, IPS is extremely painful to do within a VM. It takes a lot of CPU cycles. And if you have a very inactive network, that may be perfect. I mean, for Catbird, who Michael Berman's not here today, we say it, they also have an IDS, IPS. And they do it inline, but you have to put some sockets to it, or cores to it, to make it work best. So it also depends on the size of your network and which one you choose, and what you want to get out of your IDS, IPS. If you want prevention, that's one thing. If you want detection, that's another thing. If you want detection that turns around and leads into firewall rules, that's another thing entirely. I mean, this is a big management issue, but it's also a big issue of how do you plan what you need to do. I mean, the security folks need to know that they can get at the table, but not by saying no. They have to say, here's a solution. This is an up-and-coming threat. Here's a risk analysis. Here's a solution that will solve it. And that could
that's very much true. I think we're almost close to wrapping up here. I see that a lot. The cloud has enabled almost anybody to put a new app or machine out there without really going through their IT department. And that bypasses not only IT, but a lot of times any type of security function that might be there, checks and balances from a security perspective. So you're absolutely right. The security teams, I'm noticing that here, and I see a lot of other customers, they have to get ahead of the curve. And instead of waiting for someone to come to them with the request to do something, they have to partner more with the client and drive solutions. We need to be leading by example, showing our end users what is capable in the cloud, but making sure that there's a reference architecture in place to keep those assets secure.
Exactly. We have to do that.
Changing the game on business from security teams. There's a lot of turnover right now in security teams.
And that will continue for quite a while, I think. I mean, the main thing is that it's not only a lot of turnover, but there's a lot of people that need to understand fully that they are actually now dealing with a virtual environment or a cloud environment, and that the traditional security mechanisms may or may not work. It's a changing environment. And in a lot of enterprises, the security team's already been bypassed. So now they need to get back in the game, because what happens is the security policies as written doesn't put the burden of risk analysis and security on the team that bypassed them. It puts them clearly on their own shoulders, right?
Yep.
So the security, the teams that, like the virtualization teams that may have, like, say, hey, I'm not going to talk to security because I know it all. Well, they're not the ones at risk for getting their jobs fired, losing their jobs, I should say, because they violated policy, or policy was violated for whatever reason, and there ended up being a security breach. So the security teams need to get on the ball. They need to join the discussion, and that's a hard thing to do, because a lot of security teams are big into saying no.
Yep.
But from that perspective, when you start thinking about the cloud, it really is, security is all about the data that you put in the cloud, not about the cloud itself. Assume the cloud is not secure and just get over it and go on and secure your data, which is going to require new programming techniques. It's going to require new methods for securing the data, like in-VM encryption that really works.
Well, the problem is that a lot of DevOps guys don't know about those security technologies.
Correct.
They assume that the infrastructure, the hardware, is protected or secured.
You can't assume that, because there's always, now in any cloud, there's always one there's always one current user that's able to see everything in a fully virtualized cloud, and that happens to be the cloud admin. So I ultimately have to trust that user and that admin to do the right thing at all times. But if you go to the conferences I go to, like I just came back from Hacker Halted, social engineering really works really well. So people are still at risk.
Yep.
So any other questions or comments or anything like that?
Dave Shackelford to talk. He wasn't able to meet last time we wanted him there.
Yeah, no, he's too busy.
Okay. Did we figure out what he's got going on?
Yeah, he's giving courses on virtualization security for SANS.
Oh,
Sam
SANS.
couldn't join us because he's giving courses on virtualization security and exploit development.
And that's going to be a new program that they have going?
No, it's been going on forever. It's been going on for at least a year.
I'd be curious to get an update from them as to what kind of new things if there's any updates on their program.
I haven't heard of any lately.
What new topics they have.
Yeah, go to sans.org and check it out.
Right on.
That's the best place for anybody listening, sans.org. You can also look up datacentury.com has one. That's data-century.com.
And is it virtualization specific, cloud specific, a little of both?
Virtualization specific. The CSA has a cloud security knowledge cert that we had Rich Mogul on to talk about that from Securosis, and he talked about
I remember that one. That was actually hosted at one of the offices here in San Jose.
Yeah, it was, which is a knowledge. It's basically certifying that you have the knowledge, a minimum level set of knowledge, which is pretty good. It's hard enough to talk about this stuff when you don't have a common language. So it's worth taking. So those exist, and there's more coming along. There's one that I'm doing actually down at Nova Southeastern in a week or so, down in Fort Lauderdale. So if anybody's down there and wants to go to this, contact Nova Southeastern. It's the 14th and 15th of the month. It's a fairly beginner level. It's for security admins. It is not an in-depth, extreme in-depth that I could do, but it's really for the security admins and what they need to know to start the conversation. So it could be extremely useful to some people. So if you want, join me there. Always, thank you, Eben, for joining us. Rick, thank you for asking questions this time around. It was nice to have
Hey, no problem. Like I said, I came in to get smart, and I'm smarter.
Let us know how those hard drives work out next week.
Well, I don't need any. It's the rest of the year that I'm watching.
Well, I mean, your customers are storage driven, so we want to know, are they having any problems with that?
We're all storage driven, Ivan.
And the other thing about that is as we increase our data security for data protection, we have to reduce the amount of storage we use, and that's being done using file system inspection and change block tracking inside of vSphere and other techniques within Hyper-V. But you also need to start thinking about, data deduplication on the storage, which a lot of source and target deduplication are used by companies like Veeam. But what it ends up being is that the less storage you use per backup, the more you can put on that storage device. And that ends up eventually you're going to use up all your storage regardless. It depends on how many you keep. So now we have to talk about retention. Or do we have to now go off the tape?
Yeah.
And there's some new tape developments like LTFS that have very long shelf lives and so forth that you can then use to offload for 50 years to a tape device. Finally, those things you need to keep for that long.
Hey, you guys reminded me of something I found when I was formatting my new drive is vSphere 5 has a new feature to format with thick eager 0. Am I saying it right?
Eager 0 thick versus
Eager
lazy.
0 thick has been around forever.
No, but you can do it from the GUI now. The GUI has exposed the eager 0 feature.
Oh, the GUI is just labeled correctly now. That's the correct way of saying it.
Yeah.
Well, there's 3. You can do thin, lazy, or eager.
Well, yeah.
And before, there was only 2 options, thick or thin.
Yeah, thick the default was to do the 0 at build time of the VMDK. Lazy, I believe, is to do it as the blocks are actually used. So that you're not actually doing it up at the beginning, you're doing it as you use it, which could be an overhead for a VMDK, depending on how much performance is used. But it also could mean that your VMDK contains in file slack space things that you really don't want to know are there.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what
bad
I
idea.
From a
security
perspective is
it's not something you ever want to use.
Well, that was the default before. Before vSphere 5, a thick VM was allocated but not necessarily zeroed.
No, it was zeroed by default.
And that's why it took forever.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the new feature?
Actually, I take that back. Lazy. I mean, the standard default is to allocate in 0. The other method is to allocate, but 0 on demand. That's eager.
Yeah.
And that's actually it speeds up the creation of the VM. But
that's what I'm saying. So
it could cause security issues if you have bleed through from tenant to tenant. Because even though the block is not used, it's still readable.
So which one's the new one? Do you know for sure which one?
None of them know.
No,
They've been
one
around since
in the GUI?
2.1.
The GUI only had 2 options before. Now it has 3.
Eager would have to be the new one, I would imagine.
All right. We're going to need to ask our listeners to chime in next week and give us their opinion.
Well, we won't be here next week, but in 2 weeks.
2 weeks, next session.
But the main thing is you do not want to allocate on demand. You want to allocate.
Yeah, I thought that before you used to have to use the command line to do that correctly.
No, it was in 4. It was the default.
All right.
You want to never allocate on demand. You always want to allocate up front. Even thin is allocate on demand, but it's allocating the block and zeroing it on demand, where when you do thick eager, your blocks are already allocated, therefore you can read them if you don't have the VM up and running. Which means you could read possibly old data, and you don't want that capability. You don't in a cloud that should be anathema.
All right, guys, I'm going to drop off here.
Talk to you later, Eben. Thank you for joining us.
All right, see you.
See you.